John lived with his wife and children on a small piece of farmland just outside a quiet town. Every morning, before the sun had even stretched its light across the fields, John was already awake. His day usually began with the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of damp soil in the air. Farming was not easy, but it was honest work, and John believed that honest work kept a person strong in both body and spirit. His children often watched him move across the land with steady steps, never rushing, always focused. The family's house was simple, built of wood and painted white, with a porch that creaked under the weight of time. His wife, Clara, filled the home with warmth. She cooked meals from scratch, took care of the children, and kept the household running smoothly. Their children, 3 in number, were lively and full of curiosity. They chased each other across the yard, helped feed the chickens, and sometimes sat on the porch listening to John's quiet words of wisdom. What most people in town knew about John was only what they could see. They saw a black farmer who sold fresh vegetables and fruit at the Saturday market. They saw a man who wore worn boots and shirts that had been mended more than once. They saw someone who smiled politely but didn't talk too much about himself. To neighbors, he was hard-working, polite, and perhaps a little mysterious. No one asked many questions, because farm life was supposed to be simple. Yet there was something different about John, even if others could not name it. His children noticed it the most. He never slouched, his back was always straight. His eyes seemed to scan everything, from the tree line to the sky, as if he was always alert. He taught his children to pay attention to details, like how animals behaved before the weather changed, or how to fix a broken fence quickly before it became a bigger problem. To them, he was just their father, but they felt there was a strength in him that other fathers didn't seem to have. The farm itself was a place of peace. Fields stretched out in every direction, with rows of corn, beans, and other vegetables swaying in the wind. A red barn stood proudly, its paint fading but still strong. Horses grazed lazily, cows mooed in the distance, and chickens clucked as they searched the dirt for food. Clara often said that the land had a heartbeat, and John agreed. He worked with it like an old friend, never forcing, always respecting. Life was not perfect, but it was steady. Money was not overflowing, yet they had enough to get by. The children went to school, Clara managed the home, and John farmed the land from dawn till dusk. At night, when the sky turned dark and the stars scattered above, the family gathered together for dinner. Those were the happiest moments, the sound of laughter mixing with the smell of fresh bread and stew. Still, beneath the calm surface of their lives, John carried memories that he rarely shared. Long before the farm, before the town even knew his name, he had lived a different kind of life. It was a life of discipline, training, and missions that took him to places most people would never see. But he kept that past locked away. On the farm, he was not a soldier or a commander, he was a husband, a father, and a farmer. Clara knew about his past, of course, but she respected his silence. She knew that he wanted his children to grow up without the weight of his old world pressing down on them. Sometimes, when the nights were especially quiet, John would step outside after everyone else had gone to bed. He would stand under the stars, the cool air brushing against his face, and remember. He remembered the sound of helicopters, the weight of gear on his shoulders, the intensity of decisions made in seconds. He remembered the faces of men he had led, men who trusted him with their lives. Those memories were heavy, but they also gave him strength. They reminded him of why he valued peace so much now. The children often asked him why he never got tired, why he always seemed to know what to do. John would smile softly and say, "Because I learned that wasting time complaining doesn't fix anything. You take care of what needs to be done, and then you rest when the work is finished." To them, it was just their father's way. To John, it was the result of years of training and discipline, reshaped into lessons for farm life. The townspeople never imagined that the quiet farmer who shook their hands at the market once commanded elite soldiers. They never guessed that the calm man who stacked tomatoes in wooden baskets had once stood in dangerous places making life or death choices. For them, John was just part of the backdrop of the town, dependable but unremarkable. But peace has a way of being fragile, and simple lives often draw the wrong kind of attention. For now, though, the family lived in the rhythm of the land. The children woke early to help with chores, Clara prepared breakfast, and John led them all with patience. Each day felt almost the same, and that sameness was a comfort. There were small joys that filled their days. The children loved riding the horses around the pasture, laughing as the wind whipped through their hair. Clara loved tending to her flower garden, which added color to the edge of the farmhouse. John loved sitting on the porch after a long day, his boots dusty, his hands rough, but his heart full. When his youngest child climbed into his lap and fell asleep against his chest, he felt that every choice he had made in life had led him to the right place. Sometimes, visitors from town came by. They admired the farm's produce, bought jars of Clara's homemade jam, and complimented the children on their good manners. Everyone agreed that the family was a fine example of hard work and kindness. John accepted the praise quietly, never seeking attention, always redirecting the credit toward his wife and children. The family's life was ordinary in the eyes of most, but in truth, it carried layers unseen by others. It was a life built on discipline, patience, and sacrifice. John had chosen this path deliberately, determined to give his family stability after years of unpredictability. Every nail in the fence, every seed in the ground, and every meal at the dinner table was a promise he kept to protect them, to provide for them, and to ensure they grew up in peace. But fate has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. For now, the family was still safe within the quiet arms of their farm. They did not yet know that forces outside their land were moving, forces that would soon bring unwanted eyes onto them. The children laughed freely, the mother hummed while cooking, and the father worked the soil with steady hands. It was calm before the storm, a storm that would test not only the strength of their family but also reveal the truth about the man they called father. The first signs of trouble came quietly, almost like a shadow slipping across the farm. At first, it was just small things. A police car would slow down on the road that passed by their land, its lights off but its presence heavy. Sometimes an officer would stop and ask pointless questions, like whether the family had the right permits for their farm stand at the market. John answered calmly each time, providing documents neatly kept in a folder. The officers left with tight smiles, but the feeling they left behind was never friendly. Clara noticed the unease before the children did. She watched from the kitchen window as the patrol cars lingered by the fence. She noticed how the questions grew sharper, less about permits and more about ownership. "Do you really own all this land?" one officer once asked, staring at John as though waiting for him to falter. John had simply nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Every acre." The officer's face twitched with annoyance, as though he had hoped for a different answer. For the children, life still carried on as usual, though they began to sense that something wasn't quite right. At school, a few of their classmates repeated whispers they had heard from their parents. Rumors that the farm wasn't being run properly. Suggestions that maybe the family wasn't following the rules. The children didn't understand where such ideas came from, but they returned home unsettled. Clara comforted them, brushing off the comments as baseless. John only told them, "Remember, not everything people say is true. What matters is that we live with honesty." But honesty, it seemed, was not enough to stop the scrutiny. Soon, officers began showing up more often. They claimed they were conducting routine inspections, though no other farms in the area experienced the same attention. One week they questioned whether the barns were built to code. The next week they asked if the family had the right water rights for irrigation. Clara began to feel a pit in her stomach every time she saw a police car coming down the dirt road. She kept her children close, telling them to stay inside while the officers spoke with their father. John, however, never raised his voice or showed frustration. He met each question with measured calm, producing papers, receipts, and permits. His composure irritated the officers more than anger ever could. They left unsatisfied each time, unable to find fault but unwilling to let go. John's patience was unshaken, though inside he was taking careful note of their behavior. He had learned long ago that patterns reveal intentions. The pattern here was clear: this was not about law, it was about pressure. Neighbors began to notice the constant visits. Some whispered their sympathy, saying it wasn't fair. Others stayed silent, not wanting to be involved. A few looked the other way, perhaps fearing the same treatment. Clara felt the sting of isolation when she went into town. People smiled at her politely, but the warmth was fading. A line had been drawn, though she could not see who had drawn it. One evening, after another long day in the fields, John sat on the porch with Clara. The children had gone to bed, their laughter still echoing faintly in the walls of the house. Clara leaned against him and whispered, "Why are they doing this to us?" John took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people see strength where they don't expect it. And strength makes them uneasy." Clara wanted to ask more, but she knew by the weight in his voice that the subject ran deeper than she could fully understand. The pressure didn't let up. A letter arrived, warning of a fine for supposed code violations. John calmly drafted a reply, attaching proof that the accusations were unfounded. Days later, the fine was withdrawn, but another notice soon replaced it, this time questioning the legality of their roadside stand. Clara shook her head in disbelief. "It's like they won't stop until they find something to hold against us." John only placed a reassuring hand over hers. "We will endure," he said simply. For the children, the tension began to show in subtle ways. The eldest grew protective of his younger siblings, walking them home from school and keeping a careful eye on anyone who stared too long. The middle child asked Clara why people didn't seem to trust them anymore. The youngest, too innocent to understand, simply clung to John's leg when the officers came. John bent down each time, speaking to them softly. "Do not be afraid. This is just noise. We know who we are." His words calmed them, though their young hearts still carried quiet worry. What the officers did not realize was that John's silence and patience were not signs of weakness. Behind his calm eyes was a mind always working, evaluating every word spoken, every look exchanged, every move made. Years of training had taught him to read intentions, to know when pressure was casual and when it was deliberate. He could see clearly now that this was not chance. It was not routine. It was targeted. Still, he chose restraint. The farm was his sanctuary, and his family's safety was his priority. He would not let anger provoke him into actions that could be used against them. Instead, he maintained the appearance of a simple farmer dealing with unwanted trouble. But deep inside, he prepared himself for what might come. His instincts whispered that the storm was only beginning. One Saturday at the market, the tension became more public. John and Clara set up their stand as usual, laying out baskets of tomatoes, cucumbers, and fresh corn. Customers came, smiling and chatting. But then two officers arrived, walking slowly, their presence heavy. They began inspecting the produce, asking loud questions about whether the family was licensed to sell. People watched, some whispering, some avoiding eye contact. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she bagged vegetables for a customer. John stood tall, answering each question calmly, his voice carrying enough steadiness that even the onlookers felt reassured. The officers eventually left, but the damage was done. The crowd had seen the family singled out, and whispers spread again. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but John placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Let them talk. Truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat at the table, her worry spilling out. John, they won't stop. What if this gets worse? He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady and full of unspoken history. If it does, he said slowly, then they will learn that we are not as small as they believe. Clara didn't fully understand, but she trusted him. She always had. What she did not know was that John's words came not from pride, but from certainty. He had faced storms before, storms far greater than this. He had endured pressure, intimidation, and danger. He had led others through it. If this town wanted to test his family's strength, they would soon find themselves facing something they were unprepared for. For now, though, he kept his past hidden. He rose each morning to tend the land, spoke gently to his children, and treated his wife with the steady love that had carried them through every season. Outwardly, he was still the quiet farmer. Inwardly, the commander within him was beginning to wake, readying himself for the battles he hoped would never come, but knew might be inevitable. The day that changed everything began like any other. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, painting the fields in soft golden light. John was already outside, moving through the rows of corn with calm steps. His hands brushed against the stalks, checking their growth, his mind focused on the day's work. Inside the house, Clara was preparing breakfast, her children's voices floating through the open windows as they chatted sleepily. The family's life seemed steady, but underneath that peace, a storm was quietly gathering strength. By mid-morning, a sound broke the rhythm of the farm. Gravel crunched on the dirt road leading to their property. Clara glanced out the window, her heart tightening when she saw not one but several police cars rolling slowly toward the house. Dust rose behind the vehicles as they came to a stop near the barn. Doors opened, and a group of officers stepped out, their presence heavy and intentional. The children, who had been playing near the porch, froze. Clara quickly called them inside, her voice steady though her heart raced. "Come in now," she said, trying not to let her worry show. They obeyed without question, their wide eyes betraying their unease. John walked toward the approaching officers with the same calm he had always carried. His boots pressed firmly against the dirt, his shoulders straight, his eyes focused. He looked like a farmer greeting visitors, but inside, his mind sharpened in an instant. Every movement, every glance from the officers, every detail of their approach was noted and stored. He had trained himself long ago to read situations quickly, and this one spoke clearly. They had not come for a polite conversation. The lead officer stepped forward, his tone clipped and firm. He began asking questions, his voice carrying across the yard. He accused John of ignoring regulations, of running the farm improperly, of breaking rules that did not exist. His words were sharp, designed to provoke. The other officers spread out slightly, as if surrounding the property. Clara stood at the window, watching with her heart in her throat. The children pressed against her sides, silent now, sensing the seriousness in the air. She wanted to rush out, to stand beside her husband, but she also knew that his calmness was their shield. John did not raise his voice. He answered each accusation with clear, steady words. He reminded the officer of the permits he had already shown countless times. He explained the farm's practices with quiet authority, his tone unwavering. His patience, however, seemed to unsettle the officers more than if he had shouted. The lead officer's face tightened, his frustration growing. "You think you're smarter than us," the officer snapped at one point, his eyes narrowing. John's expression did not change. He simply replied, "I think the truth speaks for itself." There was a pause then, a silence so heavy that even the birds in the trees seemed to stop their song. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to John's calm resistance. He was not the frightened farmer they had expected. He was unshaken, steady, and quietly in control. The children, peering through the window, saw a side of their father they had never seen before. His voice was still gentle, but it carried a strength that seemed unbreakable. He stood like an oak tree in a storm, unmoving, unbending. For the first time, they realized that their father's calmness was not just about patience, it was something deeper, something trained and purposeful. The officers tried again, asking for documents, searching for flaws. John produced the papers neatly, each one in perfect order. There was no mistake, no gap, no weakness for them to use. With each passing moment, the balance of power shifted subtly. The officers had arrived expecting to intimidate, but now it was they who seemed unsettled. Clara whispered softly to her children, "Do you see your father? He is calm because he knows the truth. Remember that." Her words gave them comfort, though their small hands still clutched at her dress. As the exchange continued, the lead officer's tone grew sharper, his patience wearing thin. He stepped closer to John, as if trying to loom over him. But John's steady gaze met his without fear. For a moment, it was as though two worlds were colliding: the world of authority trying to intimidate, and the world of quiet strength that refused to be shaken. "Why don't you ever lose your temper?" the officer asked suddenly, his voice low but edged with frustration. John's reply was simple, but it carried weight. "Because anger clouds judgment. And I don't waste energy on what isn't true." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The other officers exchanged glances, and even the lead officer seemed momentarily thrown off balance. It was a reply he hadn't expected, one that revealed more than it seemed on the surface. The standoff lasted nearly an hour, though to Clara and the children watching, it felt much longer. Finally, with no fault to find, the officers turned back to their cars. Their departure was slow, as though they wanted to leave an impression of control. But the truth was clear: they had been unable to break the farmer's composure. When the cars finally disappeared down the dirt road, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She hugged her children tightly, whispering reassurance, though her own heart still pounded. She looked out at John, who remained standing in the yard, his eyes scanning the horizon as if the confrontation were still unfolding. Later that evening, as the sun set and painted the fields in deep orange, the family gathered on the porch. The children clung to John, asking him questions in hurried voices. "Why weren't you afraid? Why didn't you shout back? How did you stay so calm?" John looked at each of them, his face softening. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Fear doesn't solve anything," he said. "Shouting doesn't solve anything. What matters is knowing the truth and standing firm in it. If you do that, no one can take your strength away." The children listened intently, their young faces lit by the glow of the setting sun. For the first time, they understood that their father was more than just a farmer. He carried a kind of strength they couldn't fully explain but could feel deeply. It was a strength that came from experience, from discipline, from something beyond their understanding. Clara watched him, her heart full of both pride and worry. She knew there was more behind his calmness than he let on. She had seen glimpses of it before, in the way he carried himself, in the quiet discipline of his daily life. But today had revealed even more. She wondered how much longer he could keep his past hidden, how long before others realized that John was not just a farmer. That night, when the children were asleep, John sat outside under the stars. Clara joined him, resting her hand on his. For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of the night surrounding them. Finally, Clara spoke softly. "You showed them today. You showed them you're not ordinary." John's eyes stayed fixed on the stars. "I don't want to show them anything," he said quietly. "I just want peace." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "But you can't hide who you are forever." He turned to look at her then, his gaze steady, his voice low. "I'm not hiding. I'm protecting. There's a difference." The weight of his words lingered between them. Clara nodded slowly, understanding even if she wished it weren't so. She leaned against him, feeling the quiet strength in his presence. For now, they still had their peace, but she knew the storm was not yet over. And deep inside, John knew it too. His patience had kept the farm safe for now, but the eyes of the authorities were not gone. They would return, and when they did, the truth of who he really was would no longer remain hidden. The days after the confrontation carried a different air around the farm. Though the fields still grew, the animals still grazed, and the children still laughed, there was a quiet awareness that something had shifted. The officers had left without achieving what they wanted, but it was clear they had not given up. Their departure had been reluctant, their eyes filled with unfinished intent. Word spread quickly in town. People who had been at the market, or who had seen the line of patrol cars driving toward the farm, began to talk. Some repeated the story with awe, describing how John had faced the officers with unshakable calm. Others added their own details, whispering that the farmer's composure was not natural, that perhaps there was more to him than met the eye. At first, John ignored the whispers. He continued his work, tending the land with the same patience as always. But he noticed the looks when he went into town. Some were respectful, others suspicious. A few older men, veterans themselves, watched him with sharp eyes, as though trying to place a memory. One afternoon, while John was unloading crates of vegetables at the market, a man in his 60s approached. His walk was slow but steady, his back still straight despite the years. He stopped in front of John, studied him for a long moment, and then extended his hand. "It's been a while," the man said softly. John looked at him closely, and recognition flickered in his eyes. They shook hands firmly, the grip of men who understood each other without needing words. The man, a retired soldier, turned to the crowd that had gathered nearby. His voice was low but carried weight. "Do you all know who this is?" he asked. The townspeople leaned closer, curious. "You think he's just a farmer, but you're wrong. I served in uniform for decades, and I've seen his face before. This man led missions most of you will never hear about. He's not ordinary. He's Delta Force." The words struck the crowd like a bell. People exchanged surprised looks, whispers rising quickly. Some asked if it was true, others stood silently, trying to take in the revelation. John didn't confirm or deny it, he simply continued stacking his produce, his expression calm, his silence more powerful than any speech. Clara, who had been standing nearby, felt her heart tighten. She had always known the day might come when John's past would no longer stay in the shadows. Now it was unfolding in front of their neighbors, and there was no stopping it. That evening, when they returned to the farm, the children asked their father directly. "Daddy, what does it mean? What's Delta Force?" John sat with them on the porch, his hands folded, his eyes thoughtful. He spoke carefully, choosing words that were simple but true. "It means that before I was a farmer, I served my country. I was part of a team that was asked to do very hard things. Things most people never know about. It was dangerous, and it required discipline. But it also taught me the value of peace." The children listened with wide eyes, their young minds trying to imagine their quiet father in such a role. The eldest asked, "Is that why you're never afraid?" John smiled gently. "I feel fear, just like anyone. But I learned that fear doesn't have to control you. What matters is how you stand when fear comes." Clara watched the exchange, her heart heavy with pride and concern. She knew the truth of his past would change the way people saw them. For some, it would bring respect. For others, suspicion. Either way, life would no longer be as simple as before. And indeed, the following days confirmed it. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached with admiration. Some shook John's hand, thanking him for his service. A few even offered to help on the farm, their attitudes shifted by the knowledge of who he truly was. At the same time, however, others grew colder. Certain officials in town, upon hearing the whispers, seemed more determined than ever to make his life difficult. It was as if his hidden strength had threatened their sense of power. One morning, a local newspaper carried a small story about the farmer with a mysterious past. The article did not name Delta Force directly, but it hinted strongly at John's military background. The reporter wrote about his calm confrontation with the police, about his reputation for discipline and silence. For many readers, it was a story of quiet heroism. For others, it was a reason to keep watching him closely. John himself remained unchanged. He still rose before dawn, still worked the fields with steady hands, still spoke to his children with patience and kindness. But inside, he knew that the balance had shifted. His past was no longer completely hidden. The officers who had once tried to intimidate him now understood that the man they were targeting was not just a farmer. He was someone who had led men in the hardest of circumstances, someone trained to remain unbroken under pressure. Clara felt the change in the way people treated them when she went to town. Some women whispered admiration, calling her strong for standing beside such a man. Others looked at her with unease, as though being married to someone with such a history made her different too. She carried herself with dignity, just as John did, but she could feel the divide. For the children, the revelation became a source of both pride and confusion. Their friends at school asked endless questions. Some admired them for having a father who had served at such a high level. Others teased them with rumors they had heard. The children learned quickly to answer with the same calmness their father had shown. "He's just our dad," they would say. And in truth, that was how they still saw him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the farm in golden light, the family sat together on the porch. The children had been quieter than usual, weighed down by the attention their father's past had brought. John looked at them and said, "I don't want you to feel burdened by who I was. I want you to understand that everything I did before was so that one day, I could have this life with you. The farm, the peace, the laughter, that's what matters. Not the titles or the past. Just this." The children nodded slowly, comforted by his words. Clara leaned against him, her heart filled with both pride and gratitude. She knew the world outside their farm might still try to test them, but she also knew that her husband's strength was more than enough to carry them through. As night settled and the stars appeared one by one, John stepped into the yard, looking out over the land. The fields stretched out like a promise, steady and enduring. He breathed in the cool night air and thought about the road that had brought him here. He had walked through places of darkness and danger, but now he stood in the light of home. Yet he also knew that storms often return. The officers had tested him and failed to break him, but they might come again, more determined than before. And when they did, the truth of who he was would stand like a wall that could not be moved. For now, the revelation had changed everything. The quiet farmer was no longer just a farmer in the eyes of the town. He was something more, and whether people accepted it with respect or with fear, they could no longer dismiss him. His presence carried weight, his silence carried authority, and his past, once hidden, had now stepped into the light. The weeks that followed the revelation carried both calm and tension, like the sky before a summer storm. Around the farm, life went on much as it always had. The corn still swayed in the breeze, the cattle still grazed, and the children still ran barefoot through the fields. Yet in the town, the story of John's past had taken on a life of its own. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into debates. Some spoke of respect, others of suspicion. But no matter the tone, everyone now looked at the farmer with different eyes. For John, nothing had truly changed inside. He still woke at dawn, still worked the land with the same steady rhythm, and still returned home to his family each evening with a heart grounded in peace. But Clara noticed the way he carried himself now. Though his posture had always been strong, there was a new weight in his presence, as though people's expectations pressed upon him. He had never asked for recognition, but now it had come whether he wanted it or not. The children also felt the difference. At school, some of their classmates treated them with admiration, proud to be friends with the children of a man who had served at the highest level. Others teased them out of jealousy or misunderstanding. "Your dad's a soldier, not a farmer," one boy sneered once. The eldest child replied calmly, echoing his father's wisdom, "He's both, but most importantly, he's our dad." The words silenced the room, because truth spoken simply often carries the most power. Back at the farm, the family learned to live with the new attention. Neighbors stopped by more often, bringing small gifts or offers of help. Some wanted to thank John for his service, others simply wanted to stand near the strength they felt in him. Clara accepted their kindness politely, though she could see that John grew restless with the extra attention. He wanted nothing more than to return to the quiet life he had built. But not everyone was willing to leave them in peace. The local authorities, embarrassed by their failed attempts to intimidate the family, returned with new approaches. Letters arrived again, filled with accusations and fines that had no foundation. Officers drove slowly past the farm at night, their headlights cutting across the fields like searchlights. It was clear they still wanted to test the family, still wanted to break what they could not understand. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Clara voiced the worry that had been heavy on her heart. "John, how long can this go on? They won't let us be." John looked around the table at his children's faces, then back at Clara. His voice was calm, but it carried an unshakable firmness. "As long as it must. We have faced worse storms than this. And storms always pass." The next day proved his words true. The officers arrived once more, but this time something was different. When they stepped out of their cars, they found not only John waiting for them but also a group of townspeople gathered by the fence. Word of the family's struggles had spread, and now the community had chosen to stand with them. Some were neighbors who had once kept silent, others were veterans who understood what John had sacrificed. Together, they formed a quiet wall of support. The lead officer hesitated, glancing at the crowd. His tone was less sharp this time, his words less bold. He asked his questions, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. John answered with the same calm clarity as always, handing over papers, explaining the truth, never once raising his voice. The difference was that now, his words were not only his own. The community bore witness, and in their silence was their strength. When the officers left again, empty-handed and unsettled, the crowd did not cheer or shout. They simply nodded to John, their presence a sign that he was no longer alone in facing the pressure. Clara felt her chest fill with relief as she watched the people disperse, some stopping to pat John's shoulder or thank him before they left. For the first time in many months, she felt the weight lifting. That night, the family sat together under the wide open sky. The stars shimmered like lanterns, and the air was filled with the soft hum of crickets. The children leaned close to their father, their voices curious and thoughtful. "Daddy," the youngest asked, "why did everyone come to help today?" John smiled gently, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Because when people see the truth, when they see someone standing strong, it gives them courage too. And courage shared is stronger than courage kept alone." The children nodded, their young hearts beginning to understand the power of unity. Clara reached for John's hand, her eyes glistening with quiet gratitude. She had always known he was strong, but now she saw how his strength had spread beyond their home, into the hearts of others. She whispered, "You've given them more than you know." John shook his head softly. "I only want to give my family peace. If others find strength in that, then I'm grateful. But for me, this," he gestured toward the farmhouse, the fields, the children, "this is enough." The days that followed grew lighter. The officers stopped their visits, their attempts weakened by the watchful eyes of the community. The letters stopped coming, the fines disappeared. Slowly, the storm that had hung over the farm began to clear. The family's life returned to its rhythm, though now it carried a new layer of respect from those around them. In town, people spoke differently of the farmer family. They were no longer whispered about with suspicion, but spoken of with admiration. The story of the quiet man who had stood unshaken spread beyond the town, carried by word of mouth and quiet articles in local papers. John never sought the recognition, but it came anyway, and with it came protection. For the children, the experience became a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had seen their father face pressure without anger, endure injustice without breaking, and lead with quiet dignity. They learned that true strength is not loud, but steady. That peace is not weakness, but the highest form of power. Clara, too, found her heart changed. She no longer lived in constant fear of the officers' cars or their empty accusations. Instead, she found pride in the resilience of her family and in the man she had married. She had always known John was different, but now she saw clearly how extraordinary his strength truly was, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. As for John, he remained the same in his essence. He still rose with the dawn, still worked the land with patient hands, still spoke with the calmness that had carried him through so much. But he knew now that his past could never be completely hidden. And perhaps it was better that way. Because his past was not a burden, it was a foundation. It was what allowed him to build a life of peace for his family, even in the face of trials. One evening, as he stood at the edge of the field watching the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, John thought about the journey he had taken. From battlefields far away to the quiet soil beneath his boots, from leading men through danger to guiding his children with patience, his life had been a circle of strength and peace. He breathed deeply, the air cool against his skin, and whispered to himself, "This is where I was meant to be." The farm, once a target of unfair eyes, now stood as a symbol of resilience. The family, once harassed, now lived with the quiet respect of their neighbors. And the man who had once been a commander, now simply called farmer, remained unshaken, a living reminder that true strength does not need to shout, and that peace, once fought for, is the greatest victory of all.